The dusty Montana settlement of Willow Creek buzzed with cruel laughter as the stagecoach arrived, carrying a woman no one believed would survive the journey. Her name was Ruth, 24 years old, with pale blue eyes that stared at nothing and a white cane clutched in her trembling hands. The men had sent for her as a joke, a blind bride for the ugliest man in the territory. Garrett Kane stood apart from the crowd, his back against the saloon wall, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Scars twisted across his left cheek from a bear attack 10 years ago, and women had crossed the street to avoid him ever since. He had not asked for a wife. He had not asked for anything in a very long time. Ruth stepped down from the coach, her cane tapping the wooden boardwalk, her head tilted as she listened to the whispers around her. She heard the word blind, and the word monster, and the word joke. Her fingers tightened on her cane, but she did not turn back. She had nowhere else to go. The crowd parted as Garrett pushed off from the wall and walked toward her, his boots heavy on the planks, his shadow falling across her small frame. She felt his presence before she heard his voice, a warmth, a stillness, something different from the cruel energy around them. He said nothing. He simply stood there, waiting. Ruth lifted her hand, her fingers reaching out into the empty air, searching for him. The crowd fell silent, watching to see what the blind woman would do. Garrett did not move away. He let her hand find his chest, his heart pounding beneath her palm, his breath catching in his throat. Her fingers traveled upward, tracing the fabric of his coat, the rough wool of his collar, the warm skin of his neck. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. Her hand came to rest on his scarred cheek, her thumb brushing across the ruined skin as though reading a story written there. The settlement held its breath, waiting for her to scream, to recoil, to confirm what everyone believed, that this man was unlovable. But Ruth's face softened into something unexpected. She smiled, a real smile, and said in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, "You are beautiful." Garrett's composure shattered like glass. His weathered face crumpled, and tears spilled down his scarred cheeks, carving tracks through the dust. No one had ever called him beautiful. No one had ever touched his scars with anything but revulsion. He dropped to his knees in the dusty street. Ruth's hands found his face again, cupping his jaw, her thumbs wiping away his tears. She told him she had been blind since birth, and she had learned to see with her hands and her heart. She told him the world had called her broken too. She told him they could be broken together. Garrett lifted her into his arms, her cane clattering to the boardwalk, her body weightless against his chest. He carried her to his wagon, past the gaping crowd, past the men who had planned this as entertainment. He did not look back. He had been looking back his whole life. It was time to look forward. The journey to his cabin took 3 days, Ruth riding in the wagon bed with blankets piled around her, asking him to describe everything they passed. He told her about the mountains, the rivers, the colors of the sky at dusk. She listened with her whole body, seeing through his words what her eyes never could. At the cabin, Garrett carried her inside and set her on a chair by the fireplace. He showed her the space by guiding her hands to the table, the bed, the window. She asked him to describe the view, and he stumbled over words like beautiful and majestic, feeling foolish. She told him his words were enough. Weeks passed, and Ruth learned the cabin by heart 12 steps from the bed to the door, 4 steps from the door to the table, the warm spot by the hearth where the sun fell each afternoon. Garrett watched her move through his home with wonder, seeing it new through her blind eyes. She began to cook, measuring ingredients by touch and smell, creating meals that filled the cabin with warmth. Garrett came in from the fields to find bread on the table and Ruth waiting for him. Her face turned toward the door, listening for his footsteps. He started hurrying home. One evening, Ruth asked Garrett to describe his scars. He was silent for so long she thought he had left the room. Then his voice came, low and raw, telling her about the bear, the pain, the years of being called a monster. She reached out and found his face, tracing each scar with gentle fingers. She told him the scars felt like mountains on a map, each one a story of survival, each one proof that he had lived through something terrible and kept going. She told him she had never seen a mountain, but she had heard they were magnificent. She told him he was magnificent. Garrett broke again, weeping into her lap, his broad shoulders shaking with decades of loneliness. Ruth stroked his hair, humming a song her mother used to sing, and held him until the tears stopped. In the morning, he woke on the floor beside her chair, her hands still resting on his head. Months later, a traveling minister passed through the settlement and heard the story of the blind bride and the scarred mountain man. He rode up to the cabin, expecting to find misery. Instead, he found a thriving homestead, a garden heavy with vegetables, and two people laughing at the kitchen table. The minister offered to marry them, and Ruth said yes before Garrett could speak. He looked at her, his scarred face flushed, and asked if she was certain. She reached out, found his hand, and said she had never been more certain of anything in her blind life. The wedding was small, just the minister, Garrett's old dog, and the mountain standing witness. Ruth wore a dress she had sewn by touch, and Garrett wore a clean shirt she had pressed with her hands. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ruth kissed Garrett's scarred cheek. Word spread back to Willow Creek, and the men who had sent Ruth as a joke came to see for themselves. They found Garrett standing taller than they remembered, his face no longer hidden, his eyes soft with happiness. They found Ruth sitting on the porch, her hand in his, her face lifted to the sun. One of the men asked Ruth if she regretted her choice, if she wished she could see her husband's face. Ruth turned her blind eyes toward him and smiled. She said she saw her husband perfectly, his kindness, his patience, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. She said that was more than enough. The men left humbled, and the story of the blind bride became legend across the territory. Garrett and Ruth lived 40 more years in that cabin, and every evening he described the sunset to her. And every evening she told him it sounded beautiful, almost as beautiful as him. A final wide shot of the cabin at golden hour. Garrett, old and gray now, sitting beside Ruth on the porch, their hands intertwined. The sun paints the mountains in shades of gold and rose, and Ruth's blind eyes reflect the light as though she can see it after all. The man the world called ugly, and the woman the world called broken, became the greatest love story the frontier ever knew.